Hey guys, this is Micah from Epium, and today I'm going to be doing a composite in reference to The Hunger Games. I'm really excited for the movie. I can't wait to see what Gary Ross came up with. I'm hoping that it's going to be pretty awesome. This is the first usage of CS6 for us. We actually just downloaded it this morning, and we wanted to use it for this tutorial, this composite, and it worked out pretty well. We definitely love a lot of the new features. There's a lot of really cool stuff. Plus the interface itself is awesome. We love the Lightroom 4 look. A lot of the tools match a lot of things from Lightroom, like the cropping tool and other really cool functions. We'll probably make a couple tutorials of the new Photoshop functions. I'm sure there will be dozens of other people out there doing the same thing, since it's a brand new program and it's a big step up over CS5. So we didn't have a bow and arrow, so we decided to use the top of an IKEA lamp as the arrow and an attachment to a vacuum cleaner as the bow. So here's the photo that we're going to use. Uni's holding the top of the IKEA lamp and the vacuum cleaner attachment. And to get the attention of the arrow, we actually had to run a cord through the top of the IKEA lamp and tie a knot on the end so that we could get the right amount of leverage so that there was nice tension on her finger and it stayed basically parallel to her body. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the lasso tool, and I'm going to lasso kind of close to her body to remove most of the green screen so that we get a decent key. And I'm going to just duplicate that layer, Command J, and then I'm going to add a new layer between the background and that new layer, and I'm going to add 50% gray to it. And then we're going to use the remove background tool. This was one of the tools that we were having problems with. It's not very accurate since they changed the icon, so we had to use caps lock to get it so it's pinpoint accurate. Still, we were having some trouble with it. It wasn't being very cooperative. Another tool that we were having a lot of problems with was the background eraser tool. The discontiguous and contiguous module part of that tool was not working at all. So we had to manually go in and just use the regular erase tool to clean up all the edges. It was a lot more time consuming than I had hoped, so we're gonna fast forward through most of the removal of all of this stuff. Now we want to hit transparency lock and zoom into the layer, and we're going to choose our brush and select color. We're going to make sure our opacity is at 100 for now, and we're going to eyedrop some part of the hair, and we're just going to start brushing out the hair to get rid of all the green and kind of blend it. You might have to select a couple other parts of the hair to get a really nice blending color. It'll take some trial and error. And then move on to the face and the body, the coat, and everything else. Clean all that up. Now we need to take the end of this rod for the arrow, because that's what we're going to make the arrow out of. So we're going to select the marquee tool, and we're just going to lasso this area out. Duplicate that layer, and we're going to hide it for now. Now we're going to choose layer 1, the layer that the girl is on, and we're going to duplicate that layer as well, because we're going to fix some of the perspective on the hand. So we're going to lasso it out and transform warp, and we're just going to pull up the corners and whatnot. We want the vacuum cleaner attachment to be a little bit more vertical and the hand to appear a little bit higher. As you zoom in, you can see a couple of the rendering problems with CS6. It renders things back and forth. We're going to try the heal tool and clean up some of these little lines that you may see. For the most part, it does a pretty decent job. We noticed the heal tool doing other things we had some problems with. It wasn't as clean as CS5. Hopefully that's just a bug. Now I'm going to go ahead and lasso out the hand one more time and transform warp to try and get it a little bit more vertical and to line it up a little bit better. And then once again clean up the image. Now we're going to take the top of this vacuum cleaner attachment and we're going to make a marquee around just the top of it. And we're going to duplicate that layer and then we're going to transform it and zoom out quite a ways first before you transform it and pull it out as far as you can to get it really nice and long because we're going to need it for the upper and the bottom part. And this is going to be our bow. Now duplicate the layer you just transformed, which will be your bow. And we're going to transform it and flip vertical. Pull it down, and as you can see, the bow starts to look like a huge rod. We're going to zoom all the way out and pull it down some more. So now it's nice and long and looks a lot smoother, and the light drop off helps it to look a little bit more realistic with the lighting situation. Now I'm going to go ahead and take another selection of the arrow for something that I'm going to use later on. The coolest feature about Photoshop CS6 is you can save while you work. It saves in the background, as you can see down in the left hand corner. Now let's take the top of the bow, layer 4 for now. We'll rename them in a bit. We're going to marquee and then inverse and delete, so that we have a shorter point to deal with, because when we start to transform it, if it's extremely long, it won't warp correctly and will be very difficult. So let's hit transform and warp, and as you can see, it's a lot easier to move the points. And we're just going to bend it so that it looks like the bow is bending. When I took the photo, the vacuum cleaner attachment was hiding the end of the cuff, so I took an additional photo and cropped it down to just the cuff. So we're just going to copy and paste it in here and composite it with the original image so that there's a cuff behind the bow. And I'm going to add a brightness contrast to the cuff layer and bring down the brightness a little bit so that it blends with the original layer. Now let's work on the bottom of the bow. So we're going to get it as close to the hand as possible, and then we're going to mask it out. We want to transform it and make it a little bit wider on each side so it looks believable. And we're going to add the layer mask and just brush it out, and the hand will start to look like it's actually holding something that's not a vacuum cleaner attachment. Once that looks nice, we're going to drag the bottom of the bow layer out, and we're going to lasso out the part that we want and duplicate the layer. And then we're going to move that layer mask from that original layer and add it to the duplicated layer, and then delete the original bottom of the bow. Now I want to realign it with the hand where the mask was at. Should be relatively easy. There was probably a different way that I could have done this. It was just how I did it at the time. Zoom as far out as you can. And then I'm going to transform it and warp, and we're going to pull the bottom out so that it looks like the bottom of the bow, and make sure to bend it nicely. Now we're starting to get a lot of layers, so let's go ahead and rename these so that we know which is which. Probably should have done that in the first place, but sometimes I don't name layers, I just kind of work with it, but this one's going to be intense. Now we want to add some contour to the bow, so we're going to take the pen tool and we're going to make a path. We're going to add a point in the middle so that we can manipulate it and make it kind of rounded. And then we're going to right click and make selection and just hit OK. Make sure that feather radius is 0. And then we're going to hit transform and warp. And we're just going to kind of bend this in so it looks like the bow has contour. Make it a little bit thinner. Once we have a decent contour, we're going to go in and clean it up. If the warp wasn't quite correct, we might have to make a couple more lines and kind of pull it together to get it to bend. Make a couple more selections and then clone tool and heel brush it out until it looks nice. Now we're going to do the exact same for the bottom. Now let's work on the arrow. We're going to take our original layer 3, not the second duplicated one, and we're going to transform it and turn it so it's almost vertical, and then we're going to hit the marquee and select a rectangle around it, and then transform and just pull it out as far as we can get it. And then deselect, and we got this nice looking rod, this long arrow, smooth arrow. Now we want to align it with the top of the IKEA lamp and get it as close as possible. It might take some more transforming and scaling and rotating to get it perfect. Just keep working on it. Now once that's done and looks good, we want to move the layer underneath the girl layer, so that'll be layer 1 copy. And then we want to select the mask of that layer 1 copy, and we want to remove the old arrow. And by arrow I mean the top of an IKEA lamp. Yeah. Get in there and start cleaning up the arrow nicely. Might take a little bit of work to get the shadowing correctly. Once it looks good, I'm going to take the pen tool and I'm going to draw out a path underneath the finger, and then I'm going to copy the arrow layer and put it above the layer 1 copy of the girl. Once that's done, I'm going to rename the layer arrow hand, and then I'm going to clean it up using masks and whatnot. Once that's done, I'm going to start working on the arrowhead. So I'm going to choose the arrow hand and use the mask, and I'm just going to brush off the end of this. And now choose the original arrow layer and add the mask, and then brush out the rest of the arrow, because your primary layer is going to be arrow hand. Now I'm going to select the pen tool again, and I'm going to draw a triangle. This is going to be our arrow. Line it up so that the perspective looks correct. And then we're going to right click and make selection, no feather radius, and then make a new layer. And we're going to drop a paint bucket on it. And then we're going to go back to the second arrow layer that we made a while back, and we're going to duplicate it, and we're going to transform it, and we're going to make it really big because this is going to be our new arrowhead. Once we have something we like, we'll hit OK, select the newest arrowhead layer that we just made using the paint bucket, and we're going to select inverse, and then I'm going to rename that layer 5 copy arrowhead and delete the little template arrow that we just had. Now I'm going to pull back that layer and delete the rest of it so it's only the arrowhead, because we need to transform it. So we want to make sure that it looks realistic and in perspective. So now we want to add a bevel end emboss, and we want to make sure that the light is underneath the arrow, and bring down the depth, bring up the size, and fix the soften till it looks correct. And we can start moving the depth around until it looks good, and bring down the opacity on the highlights and the shadows. So let's command click the arrowhead, and then we're going to go to select, modify, smooth. And we might have to do this a couple times just to get it really nice and round. And then I'm going to select inverse and delete. Once it looks pretty good and contoured, we're going to select the layer again and transform and warp, and we're just going to kind of give it a little bit more depth to the arrow itself by dragging it out and pinching it a little bit and getting it to align a bit better perspectively. Once we have something we like, we're going to start making the attachment for the arrow to the arrowhead so that it looks a bit more believable. So we're going to duplicate the arrow hand, and we're going to command select the arrowhead and drag the marquee back a little bit, and then select inverse. I accidentally hit layer mask, just go ahead and delete that. That's not part of this. And delete on the arrow hand copy. And then transform the arrow hand copy and get it to be aligned but a little bit thicker than the arrow itself. And then we're going to lasso out the end of this and delete it. And go in for layer style, bevel and emboss, and somewhat match the settings of the arrowhead. Once that's done, we want to transform it and use warp and pull it out so that it looks like it's contoured to the arrow and the arrowhead. Once that looks good, we're going to add a brightness and contrast and link it to the arrowhead copy. And we're going to crank up the contrast to make it a little bit closer to the arrowhead color, and zoom out and see how it looks. Then we're going to free transform again and continue warping until we get it exactly how we want it to look. I'm noticing that the arrowhead is off a little bit in perspective, so I'm going to select that layer again, transform, warp it. Now let's add the string to the bow. So I'm just going to make a straight line using the pen tool. Just put 2 points and then select somewhere in the middle and drag that point out. And then hold Alt or Option and click on it so it turns into a right angle point. And then pull it back so that the perspective is correct. Now we're going to right click and stroke path, and we're going to use a brush. Make sure that your brush size is small enough so that it makes a tiny line. And go ahead and delete the path, and it looks pretty decent sized. So we're going to rename this cable. And we're going to go in and just add a bevel and emboss. You don't really have to worry about the settings, they should be fine. And there we go. Now we're going to start adding the background. So we're going to make a new layer and go to Filter, Render Clouds. Now this was one of the problems that I kept having with Photoshop CS6. Every time I tried to make it large and transform it, CS6 would crash. So this took several times for me to get it right. So what I did was I made a small marquee, like a little rectangle, and I inversed the layer and deleted it, so I just had a little tiny box of clouds, and then I transformed it to make it really big, and it kept crashing. Once it looks good, we'll leave that, and we'll add a hue saturation, and we're going to colorize and crank the saturation, and then we're going to add a curves and adjust it so the background is kind of a reddish orange. It might take some playing with it to get it correct. Now let's go all the way to the top, and we're going to start adding our adjustment layers because we're to a point where everything can be one color. So we're going to colorize and slightly change the hue and crank saturation. We want to get kind of a reddish orange color. Then I'm going to add a curves. And the levels. And fix the hue saturation. And add another curves. And once it looks decent, we'll leave it at that for now. We'll revisit the coloring later. I just want to have an idea of how I want it to look. Now I'm going to use some fire. There's lots of stock fire available on the internet for purchase or free download. If you really want to get a good one or a custom one, you can take one by yourself. I'm going to add the fire. Make sure to use screen mode for the fire, and I'm going to transform it and bring it out, and we're just going to kind of put it in the corner here and adjust it accordingly. Once I started this, I started having problems with transforming again. Same with the clouds. When I took a small image and made it larger, it would either hang or crash. I'm hoping this bug will be fixed in the future. Now I'm going to mask the fire and clean up the edges and duplicate it and move it around and transform it and just keep working on it until the fire looks good. Now I'm going to add another fire, this time a bigger one that's going to go over the entire image. Choose blend mode screen, transform it and just make it huge. And we're going to drop the opacity and add a mask and just clean it up. For the embers, I'm going to use brush presets that I got from Kaji303 from DeviantArt. Check out their stuff, it's pretty good. There's a link in the description. Now I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to drop it underneath the fire layers and randomly just put down the embers wherever. Choose a couple different colors here and there and add them all over the place. Add a bevel and emboss to the embers layer to make them look like they have a bit more depth. Make a new layer, and we're going to choose another embers brush. And then duplicate that. Add a mask and just kind of delete some of it. We want depth to the embers. Now let's go all the way to the top and we're going to add a couple more adjustment layers. We're going to add a levels, a brightness contrast. This is all just tweaking to get the colors to look like they blend together nicely. Now let's add a couple adjustment layers to the fire. So we're going to add a curves right above the fire and we're going to link it to that top fire layer. We're also going to choose one of the other fire layers and add a curve to it. And let's go all the way back up, choose brightness contrast, and fix the brightness a little bit. Go back down to the fire layer that we haven't added curves to yet. Well, the cable doesn't seem to be showing, so let's go all the way down and put it above the clouds layer. Now we're going to take our Epium logo and we're going to select all and copy it. Go back to our original image and paste it in. Now let's move it to the desired location and transform it until we get what we want it to look like. Now let's add a bevel and emboss to that layer. I don't like the way the layer looks. I want the logo to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to continue manipulating it until it gets how I want it to be. Now the amount of layers that we have is starting to get a bit out of hand, so we want to group them up. So I'm going to collapse all the panels and group up all of the relevant layers. Select all these, call them fire, and then select the rest and call them girl. Now I want to duplicate girl, make a new layer, and merge the new layer with the girl group copy. And now we'll have a solid image and clean up any problems that we might have had from the merge. Now we're going to duplicate the layer of the girl, and we're going to choose the bottom layer of the girl, and we're going to add a drop shadow and pull it out so that it's reflecting on our Epium logo. Now go back into that layer style and make sure to tick Layer Mask Hides Effects. And then we're going to add a mask to that layer, and we're just going to brush out all of the drop shadow that we don't want. Now let's choose the layer 13 copy, which is the layer above the drop shadow layer, and add a layer mask and just kind of brush out around the hair so that it looks a little bit more like it blends in. Now I'm going to lock the layer and I'm going to grab a brush, make sure the brush blend mode is back in normal, and I'm going to choose a color pretty dark red, and I'm just going to lightly brush out with a lower opacity on the end of the bow to give it depth, like it's actually curved and the light is directed in a specific area. Now I'm going to select the Epium logo layer and make a new layer above it, and I'm going to fill it using black. And I want to add a specific filter, but it won't let me do that in 16-bit channel, so I have to convert it to 8-bit channel. Now make sure your foreground color is set to a color. And we're going to go to Filter, Render Clouds. Move this layer above the girl so we can get a better idea of how it looks. And then we're going to go to Filter, Pixelate, Mezzotint. And then I'm using medium dots and hit OK. And we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. Go to Zoom and Best, hit OK. And then do Stylized, find edges, and then invert the layer. And we're going to repeat the process a couple times until we get some nice light rays. Once we have it looking pretty good, we're going to add a layer and link it to that light ray layer. And we're just going to move the levels around until we get a nice sunbursty effect. Now I'm going to take that layer and change the blending mode to screen. Then I'm going to drag it up in the corner about where her hand is so it looks like there's light shining from there. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to make it pretty blurry. One of these levels is making it a little bit too powerful, so we're going to delete that and fix the levels on the other layer. And then re-add the Gaussian blur. And I'm going to add a mask, and I'm just going to clean up the sunbursts around the bow. Now I'm going to go all the way to the top and select brightness contrast. And I'm going to add another curves, and I'm going to keep pushing the image until I can get it to look nice. I'm going to add another brightness contrast and an exposure and another hue saturation and another levels. Then I'm going to go back to the sunburst layer, and I'm going to mask out around the arrowhead, and then I'm going to take that layer with its levels layer and move it underneath both of the girl layers. Now let's add the text for Hunger Games. I'm going to type out the word "the", and then I'm going to choose the font Bank Gothic. You can find it online. It's a free font. Then I'm going to type out Epium and Games, all on separate layers, and align them. Then I'm going to choose the text color for each of the words. And I'm going to rasterize type and merge them all. Now I want to add lighting effects to the text layer. So I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And it's going to pull up the 3D workspace. And I had some more problems with CS6 here. It kept crashing. One time it hung for about 20 minutes, so I had to restart the file. And once it loads, I want to move the area in front of the words "the Epium Games" and adjust the light so that the spotlight is near "the" and between "the" and Epium, and then just play with all of the adjustments until I get the lighting how I want it to look. Once you like what you see, hit OK. Now I want to position the words in place. And once the words are in place, I want to use 3D extrusion, which will make it so that the words look like they're 3D block. This is a nice quick alternative to using a program like Cinema 4D or Studio Max. It's all within Photoshop. It worked pretty well for CS6. There were a couple times where it hung for a while. I did have one crash from it. Hopefully that will be addressed soon. When we're in 3D space, we can choose different tools to move it around and angle it the way we want it to look. To fix the extrusion, just double click on the layer and change the extrusion depth to about 200 pixels for this. I noticed that you couldn't move the 3D layer without being in 3D space, which is somewhat annoying because the tools are a little bit different and it uses camera movements instead of like keyboard movements. You can't really nudge layers, you have to actually move the camera around. That was kind of annoying. Now I also noticed that the 3D layer also kicked out some sort of little backdrop drop shadow. So I'm going to go back into 3D space and we're going to go all the way down to the light source, and then we're just going to tick off shadow, and that should fix that. Now the last thing that I'm going to do here is change the font colors a bit. So I'm going to add a new hue saturation, and I'm going to link it to the Epium Games text layer, and I'm going to adjust it so that it pleases the rest of the image. Well, this is the end of the tutorial. I want to thank you guys for watching. Using CS6 was pretty cool. There were a lot of problems though. This particular composite took, with all of the downtime because of the crashes, about 3.5 hours. Normally for me, this type of composite would take about 1 hour and 20 minutes. Appreciate you guys hanging in there to see how I did this. This photo is part of our Project 366. Check that out at Flickr. Our username is Epium, and please make sure to subscribe to us here on YouTube. And thanks for watching. Later.